The dojo was unusually quiet that afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor. Students stretched in silence. The soft sound of fabric brushing against fabric filled the room. Discipline lived here. So did hierarchy. At the front stood Steven Seagal, calm, composed, hands loosely folded behind his back as he spoke about control, not combat. Power, he said evenly, is not about domination, it's about awareness. Most students listened carefully, but one didn't. Near the back of the room stood a young black belt, early 30s, strong, fast, decorated with local tournament wins. He had the posture of someone used to being admired. And today, he wanted more. He stepped forward. The movement alone shifted the air. "Sensei," he said, voice confident, almost playful, "why don't we spar?" A few students looked up. Steven paused. "For what purpose?" The black belt smiled slightly. "For fun." Now here's something important about human nature. When someone challenges a respected master publicly, it's rarely about fun. It's about visibility. It's about proving something. The young black belt wasn't just asking to spar. He was testing the room, testing status, testing whether the legend was still a legend. A few students exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't typical dojo etiquette. Challenges, especially from student to master, were handled privately, if at all. Steven studied him quietly. No anger, no irritation, just observation. "You think fighting is entertainment?" Steven asked calmly. The black belt shrugged. "People say you're untouchable. I just want to see it for myself." There it was, the real reason. Curiosity mixed with ego. And ego, when placed in front of an audience, becomes bold. The dojo grew still. Even the smallest movements seemed loud now, because everyone understood something was happening beneath the surface. This wasn't about technique. It was about identity.
Let me ask you something honestly. If you were in Steven's place, would you accept the challenge to protect your reputation? Or would you refuse, knowing a master doesn't need to prove anything? Comment accept or decline below.
Because what Steven decided in the next few seconds changed the entire energy of the dojo. The silence after the challenge felt heavier than any punch. The young black belt stood tall, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. On the surface, he looked relaxed, but small details told another story. His jaw was tight, his breathing slightly elevated, his fingers flexing at his sides. Steven noticed. Experience teaches you to read what people try to hide. "You said for fun," Steven repeated calmly. A few students shifted their weight, unsure whether to watch or look down. In every dojo, there is an invisible line between confidence and disrespect. Everyone in the room could feel that line had just been crossed. The black belt stepped forward again. "I mean no disrespect," he said, but his tone carried competition. It would be good for the students to see. That sentence revealed the real motive. This wasn't about learning, it was about performance. Here's something fascinating about human behavior. When people challenge authority publicly, they often convince themselves it's for growth, but deep down there's usually another driver: recognition. The young fighter had trained for years. He had speed, strength, medals from regional competitions. In many rooms, he was the most dangerous man present. But today, there was a legend in the building, and legends cast long shadows. Standing in someone's shadow long enough can either inspire humility or awaken ego. The black belt slowly untied his belt and retied it tighter around his waist. A small gesture, but symbolic. He was preparing for war, not play. Steven's expression didn't change. "You believe sparring me will prove something?" he asked. The younger man smiled faintly. Only one way to find out. A few nervous chuckles came from the sidelines, but the senior students weren't laughing. They understood something critical. In martial arts, hierarchy exists for a reason, not to suppress growth, but to protect it. A master accepting a public challenge isn't just about physical risk. It shifts the entire structure of the dojo. If the student dominates, authority fractures. If the master dominates harshly, morale breaks. There was no fun outcome here, only consequences. Let me ask you something. Do you think younger fighters should challenge their teachers openly, or should respect come before ambition? Type challenge or respect. I'm curious what you think. The black belt stepped onto the mat first. That too was symbolic. He assumed acceptance. He assumed engagement. Steven remained where he was for a moment longer, not hesitating, observing. Confidence behaves differently than ego. Ego rushes to prove. Confidence waits to decide. The young fighter bounced lightly on the balls of his feet now, controlled, sharp, athletic. He glanced at the watching students, aware of the audience. He wanted this witnessed. Because here's another human truth. Victory feels bigger when others are watching, and defeat feels heavier. Steven finally stepped forward. No dramatic movement, no cracking of knuckles, no removal of outer layers, just calm steps onto the mat. The room instinctively widened its circle. The temperature felt different now, not physically, but emotionally. The black belt lowered into stance first, hands raised, eyes sharp. He was ready to demonstrate speed. Steven did not take a stance. He simply stood, relaxed, balanced, present, and that unsettled the challenger more than any aggressive posture could have. Be honest with yourself. If you were the younger fighter right now, would you feel confident or suddenly unsure? Because in high-level combat psychology, doubt is the first crack in the armor. And once doubt appears, everything changes.
The air inside the dojo felt heavier now. No one spoke. Even the smallest sounds, a foot adjusting on wood, a sleeve shifting, seemed amplified. The young black belt began to circle. Light on his feet, controlled, measured. On the surface, he looked confident, but confidence and adrenaline can look very similar, and only one of them is stable. Steven remained still. Not frozen, not passive. Still. There's a difference. True stillness isn't inactivity. It's awareness without tension. The black belt feinted forward, a quick shoulder twitch, testing reaction speed. Steven didn't blink. A few students leaned forward, expecting something explosive. Nothing happened. That silence did something powerful psychologically. When one fighter refuses to react emotionally, the other begins to question his own timing. Doubt is quiet, but loud inside the mind. The young fighter circled again, slightly faster now. He was trying to create rhythm, because rhythm gives control. But Steven wasn't entering that rhythm. He was disrupting it simply by not participating. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to impress someone who refused to react? How did it make you feel? Stronger or strangely unsettled? The black belt suddenly lunged. A sharp forward step, fast hand strike aimed high, clean technique. To most eyes in the room, it looked dangerous. For half a second, it seemed like he might actually land it. Then, Steven moved. Not backward, not dramatically, just a subtle pivot of the hips, a slight angle shift. His arm rose, not to block, but to redirect. The strike slid past empty space. The young fighter's momentum carried him forward. His foot placement shifted slightly off-center, and in high-level combat, inches are everything. Steven placed one hand lightly on the challenger's wrist, not gripping, guiding. The black belt stumbled 2 steps forward before regaining balance. Gasps filled the dojo. No one had clearly seen what happened. He was too efficient. The challenger reset quickly, masking the surprise on his face. But something had changed. The smirk was gone. Here's something most people misunderstand about sparring. The first exchange isn't about damage, it's about information. And Steven had just gathered everything he needed. Speed level, balance habits, reaction timing, emotional state. Meanwhile, the young black belt had gained something too. Confusion. He attacked again, faster this time. Lower angle, more force. And that was mistake number 2. When ego feels threatened, intensity increases, but clarity decreases. Steven stepped slightly inside the attack. His foot shifted just enough to remove himself from the power line. His hand redirected the strike again, but this time he added something subtle, a gentle rotation of the wrist. The black belt's balance broke instantly. His own force turned against him, in less than a second. He was on the mat, not slammed, not thrown violently. Placed. Controlled descent. The room went silent. Completely silent. No cheering, no gasps. Just stillness. Because everyone understood something profound had just happened. The young fighter wasn't hurt, but he was immobilized, effortlessly. Steven's expression hadn't changed. His breathing remained steady. His posture relaxed even while controlling a fully trained black belt. Now here's the deeper human layer. Public defeat doesn't wound the body first. It wounds identity. The challenger lay there for a brief second longer than necessary. Processing. How did that happen? He had speed. He had power. He had prepared. But preparation without awareness creates predictable movement. And predictability is weakness. Steven released him immediately. No lingering dominance. No tightening of pressure. He stepped back. Gave space. The black belt rose slowly. This time there was no bounce in his stance. No smirk. Only calculation. He circled again. But something was different. He was thinking now. And thinking in combat slows instinct. Let me ask you something honestly. Do you think losing in front of others builds character or breaks confidence? Type builds or breaks. I want your real opinion.
Because what happened next would determine whether this moment became humiliation or transformation. The young fighter attacked a 3rd time, but now there was hesitation in his movement, and hesitation is louder than aggression. Steven stepped forward instead of back,
closed distance, removed space. One hand redirected the incoming arm, the other adjusted the elbow. A slight shift of weight, and once again, the black belt found himself off balance. But this time, Steven didn't take him down. He stopped inches before it happened, held the position, let the student feel the vulnerability, then released. That was the moment the dojo truly went silent. Not because of dominance, but because everyone understood. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a lesson being delivered in real time. And the most powerful part? Steven hadn't used strength. He had used awareness. The young fighter stepped back fully now, breathing heavier, eyes no longer competitive, but searching. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The hierarchy hadn't been enforced through force. It had been revealed through control. And in that silence, every student watching realized something about themselves. The dojo didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It didn't whisper. It simply froze. The young black belt stood a few feet away from Steven now, chest rising and falling faster than before. Not exhausted, but unsettled. And there's a difference. Exhaustion comes from physical effort. Unsettlement comes from mental disruption. Steven remained exactly where he was. Relaxed shoulders, soft gaze, balanced stance without looking like he was in one. The challenger swallowed slightly. For the first time since he stepped forward, he wasn't performing for the room. He was thinking. And thinking in moments like this can feel louder than any crowd. The students along the walls felt it too. Something invisible had shifted. At the beginning of the challenge, the energy was sharp, competitive, electric. Now it was reflective, almost uncomfortable, because what everyone had just witnessed wasn't domination, it was exposure. The young black belt had thrown speed, power, and pride into the exchange. Steven had responded with timing, angle, and patience. Here's something powerful about human psychology. When someone neutralizes you without aggression, it forces you to confront yourself. If Steven had slammed him hard, the student could blame strength. If he had shouted, the student could blame emotion. If he had mocked him, the student could blame disrespect. But Steven had done none of those things. He had simply redirected. And redirection leaves no excuse. The black belt stepped forward again, slower this time. No bounce, no smirk, just focus. This time he didn't attack immediately. He circled cautiously, trying to read, trying to find something he had missed before. Steven adjusted his angle slightly, mirroring without mirroring, present without pressing. There's a concept in high-level martial arts that most outsiders don't understand. Control isn't about overpowering someone, it's about owning the space between movements. And right now, Steven owned that space completely. The challenger feinted low. Steven didn't react. He feinted high. Still nothing. A small flicker of frustration crossed the younger man's face, because when your techniques stop drawing reactions, your confidence starts shrinking. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried harder and harder at something, only to realize effort wasn't the missing piece? What changed for you? More force or more awareness? The black belt inhaled sharply and committed. A full combination this time. Fast entry, body shift, controlled strike sequence. Technically sharp, well trained. To the untrained eye, it looked overwhelming. But Steven stepped slightly offline again. Not backward, sideways. A subtle pivot of the hips redirected the entire sequence. His forearm guided the strike just enough to collapse its structure. His hand touched the elbow lightly, not forcefully, just enough. Balance disappeared. The black belt stumbled forward, and this time Steven allowed gravity to finish the lesson. A controlled sweep, a smooth rotation. The student found himself on the mat again, pinned, but gently. No pain compliance, no joint strain, just absolute control. The silence deepened, not because it was shocking anymore, but because it was undeniable. Steven held the position for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for the lesson to register, short enough to avoid humiliation. Then he stepped back, offered his hand again. This time the black belt didn't hesitate. He took it, and in that small gesture something more important happened than any takedown. The audience saw the shift. At the beginning, the challenger wanted to prove himself to everyone. Now he was learning for himself. That transformation, that quiet internal shift, is rare, because ego doesn't surrender easily. It fights, it defends, it rationalizes. But when skill meets calm certainty, ego has nowhere to hide. The young fighter bowed slightly, not formally, not exaggerated, but sincerely. Steven nodded once in return. No speech yet, no lecture, just acknowledgement. The students around the dojo weren't looking at Steven the same way they had before. They weren't impressed, they were reflective, because most of them realized something uncomfortable. At some point they had felt what the black belt felt. The urge to prove, the desire to be seen, the hunger to rise quickly. But mastery isn't rushed, and the dojo had just witnessed why. Steven stepped back toward the center of the mat. The young black belt remained standing this time, breathing steady again, but quieter inside. The atmosphere no longer felt competitive. It felt educational. And that's when the dojo truly went silent, not out of shock, but out of understanding.
Final question for this moment. Do you think the black belt was wrong for challenging him? Or was this the exact lesson he needed to grow? Type wrong or needed I want to hear your perspective.
Because what Steven said next would define everything that just happened. The dojo was still, not the tense silence from earlier, not the competitive silence before the first attack. This was different. This was the silence that follows realization. The young black belt stood facing Steven, no longer bouncing, no longer performing. His breathing had slowed, but his eyes were different now. Not defiant, not embarrassed. Searching. Steven stepped back to the center of the mat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply looked at the student and asked quietly, "Was that fun?" The question landed heavier than any throw. A few students shifted along the walls. The black belt hesitated. At the beginning, he would have answered instantly, confident, sharp. Now he took a second. "No," he admitted softly, and that honesty changed everything. Here's something powerful about human growth. The moment someone admits they were wrong internally is the exact moment transformation becomes possible. Steven nodded once. "You are talented," he said calmly. "Fast, strong, dedicated." The young fighter looked up slightly, surprised by the acknowledgement. "But," Steven continued, "you rushed." The word hung in the air. Rushed. "You attacked with intention to prove," Steven said, "not intention to understand." The dojo was so quiet that even the faint hum of the overhead lights felt loud. "When ego enters technique," Steven continued, "precision leaves." The black belt lowered his gaze. And here's what most people don't see in moments like this. Public defeat feels painful not because of losing, but because of identity. The young fighter had built his self-image around being one of the strongest in the room. Today, that image cracked. But cracks are not destruction. They are openings. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever been confident about something only to realize you still had more to learn? Did that moment discourage you or push you further? Type discouraged or motivated, because what Steven said next mattered even more than the physical exchange. "You stepped onto this mat to challenge me," Steven said evenly, "but you were really challenging yourself." The student looked confused. Steven continued, "You wanted to see if I was still capable, but what you really wanted was to see if you were ready." That sentence hit deeper than any technique. The black belt inhaled slowly. Around the dojo, students felt something shift inside themselves, because they had all felt it before. That quiet comparison, that internal question, am I ready to take the next level? But comparison can be dangerous. When ambition mixes with ego, respect fades. Steven walked a slow circle around the mat, not pacing aggressively, simply speaking while moving. "There is nothing wrong with ambition," he said. "There is nothing wrong with testing yourself." He paused. "But there is something wrong with mistaking visibility for growth." The younger man nodded slightly. Earlier, he wanted the room watching. Now he wished it were private. And that feeling, that discomfort, is often the birthplace of humility. Quick question for you. Do you believe humility can only come after failure, or can someone develop it without being humbled? Type failure or awareness. I'm curious what you think. Steven stopped in front of the student again. "You are strong," he repeated, "but strength without patience makes you predictable." He demonstrated slowly. "Each time you attacked, your shoulders lifted first. That tells me you are committing emotionally before physically." The student blinked, surprised. He hadn't even realized he was doing that. "That small signal," Steven continued, "gave me everything." Here's the deeper lesson. At high levels, fights are not won by force. They are won by reading microsignals, tension in the jaw, breath patterns, weight distribution. Steven hadn't defeated power. He had defeated predictability. The black belt straightened slightly. "Then how do I fix that?" he asked quietly. And that question, humble, sincere, is what truly silenced the dojo. Because now this wasn't a challenge anymore. It was mentorship. Steven's expression softened. "You slow down," he said. "You remove the need to prove. You train without audience in your mind." He gestured around the room. "When you stepped forward, you were fighting for them." He tapped lightly over the student's chest. "You should be fighting for clarity here. No aggression, no humiliation, just direct truth." The younger fighter bowed deeply this time, not because he had to, because he wanted to. The students along the walls felt the weight of the moment. They had witnessed something rare, a master who could dominate but chose to educate, and a challenger who could have defended his pride but chose to listen.
Steven turned slightly to address the entire dojo. "Remember this," he said calmly. "The most dangerous fighter in the room is not the fastest, not the strongest." He paused. "It is the one who has nothing to prove." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reflective. Every student replayed their own moments of ego, their own silent competitions, their own need to be seen. And they understood now why the dojo had gone silent earlier. Not because a black belt was thrown, but because ego had been gently dismantled, without cruelty. Final question for you. If you were that black belt, would you feel embarrassed or grateful? Type embarrassed or grateful below. Because sometimes the greatest victories in life are the ones where you don't win, you learn.
The dojo remained still long after Steven finished speaking. No one moved immediately. No one whispered. Because what had just happened felt bigger than a sparring session. It felt personal. The young black belt was still standing in front of Steven, but his posture had changed completely. At the beginning, his chest had been lifted high. Now, his shoulders were relaxed, not defeated, grounded. There's a powerful psychological shift that happens when someone stops defending their pride. Their body softens, their breathing deepens, their eyes stop scanning for approval. And for the first time that afternoon, the young fighter looked calm. Not the aggressive calm of confidence, but the quiet calm of understanding. Steven stepped closer again, not as an opponent this time, but as a teacher. "Come," he said gently. The two returned to the center of the mat. Steven motioned for him to attack again. A small wave of surprise moved through the room. The black belt hesitated. This time he didn't rush. He didn't bounce. He didn't glance at the audience. He simply inhaled and stepped forward slowly. The difference was immediate. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his breathing steady, his movement cleaner. Steven allowed the attack to come halfway before redirecting it lightly. Not throwing, not sweeping, just guiding the momentum aside. Then he stopped. "Better," Steven said. Just one word. But that word meant more than applause. Because validation after correction builds confidence in a way ego never can. The students along the wall straightened slightly. They were watching transformation happen in real time. The black belt tried again. This time his focus wasn't on overpowering. It was on balance, on reading distance, on awareness. Steven countered smoothly, but less dramatically. He adjusted, paused, corrected. It no longer looked like domination. It looked like instruction. And here's something important. Humility doesn't make you weaker. It makes you adaptable. Earlier, the young fighter was rigid. Now, he was learning. Steven gently tapped his stance with his foot. "Lower your center," he advised. The student adjusted immediately. They moved again. This time the exchange lasted longer, fluid, controlled, balanced. There were no gasps from the room now, only quiet observation. Because the students weren't watching a fight anymore, they were watching growth. After a few more movements, Steven stepped back and nodded. "That is how you test yourself," he said calmly, without noise, without performance. The black belt bowed deeply again. This time there was no trace of ego in the movement, only respect. And respect in a dojo is not about rank, it's about awareness. Steven turned to face the rest of the class. "Today you saw two versions of the same fighter," he said. "A fighter controlled by ego," he glanced briefly at the young man, not accusingly, just truthfully. "And a fighter controlled by discipline." The room absorbed that. Because every single student knew they carried both versions inside themselves. Steven continued. "You will all feel the desire to prove something one day, to your peers, to your teachers, to yourself." He paused. "But remember, skill grows in silence. Ito grows in front of crowds." That sentence lingered. The dojo that once felt tense now felt unified. The younger black belt stepped back in line with the others. No one looked at him with judgment. If anything, there was admiration. Because facing your ego publicly takes courage. Steven clapped his hands once, not loudly. "Class," he said simply. And just like that, training resumed. But something fundamental had shifted. The movements were sharper, the focus deeper, the atmosphere calmer. Because the lesson hadn't been about who was stronger, it had been about who was aware.
Let me ask you something. Do you think the black belt gained more from losing publicly, or would a private correction have been better? Type public or private. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
As the class continued, the dojo no longer felt like a place of competition. It felt like what it was always meant to be, a place of refinement. And sometimes, refinement begins the moment ego steps aside. Training resumed that afternoon. Feet moved across the wooden floor, breathing synchronized, commands echoed lightly through the room. But something was different. The energy had shifted from competition to reflection. The students weren't just practicing techniques anymore. They were thinking about pride, about pressure, about the quiet hunger to be seen. The young black belt trained with the group, no longer trying to stand out. His movements were controlled, focused, measured. And here's the interesting part. He didn't look smaller. He looked stronger, because confidence built on humility is stable. Earlier, he had tried to rise by challenging the master. Now, he was rising by correcting himself. That's growth. Steven observed quietly from the front of the dojo. He didn't single the student out again. He didn't praise him excessively. He simply allowed the lesson to settle naturally. That restraint mattered, because true mentors don't milk moments for attention. They let them breathe. After class ended, students lined up to bow. The ritual felt heavier today, not in tension, but in meaning. When it was the black belt's turn to bow to Steven, there was no hesitation, no ego, just respect. And in that bow, the dojo understood something powerful. The silence earlier wasn't caused by skill. It was caused by realization. Realization that mastery isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush to prove. It simply exists. Here's something worth thinking about. Most people believe strength is demonstrated in the moment of victory. But real strength often shows up in the moment after defeat, when you decide whether to defend your pride or develop your character. Let me ask you directly. If you were that black belt, would you have walked away embarrassed? Or would you have stayed and absorbed the lesson? Type embarrassed or grateful, because that choice defines growth. Later that evening, a few students quietly discussed what they witnessed. Not the takedowns, not the speed, but the composure. The way Sensei didn't humiliate him, one student said softly. That's power, another replied. And that observation captures the entire moment. Power without cruelty, authority without arrogance, correction without humiliation. That balance is rare, not just in martial arts, but in life. Think about it. How often do people use moments of advantage to dominate, to embarrass, to remind others of their position? Steven could have ended the challenge harshly. He could have made an example out of the student. Instead, he made a lesson out of the moment. And that's why the dojo went silent, not because a black belt was taken down, but because ego was dismantled without violence. There's a deeper psychological truth here. We all carry two fighters inside us, one that wants recognition and one that seeks refinement. The first one speaks loudly, the second one trains quietly. The first one wants applause, the second one wants progress. The young black belt walked into that afternoon feeding the first fighter. He walked out strengthening the second. And the students who witnessed it, they'll remember that silence far longer than any flashing sparring match, because silence often signals impact. Before leaving, Steven gathered the class one final time. Remember, he said calmly, discipline is not about defeating others. He paused. It's about defeating the part of you that needs to prove. No dramatic ending, no applause, just understanding. And sometimes, that's more powerful than any victory. Final question for you. In your own life, are you fighting to prove something to others, or training to improve yourself? Be honest, because the answer to that question determines whether your journey is driven by ego or guided by mastery. If this story reminded you that humility is stronger than pride, drop a comment with the word discipline. And remember, the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, it's the quiet one who has already mastered himself.